progress.
My name's Terry Conway, and I'm a member of the Steering Committee of Anti-Capitalist Resistance, a revolutionary organisation organising in England and Wales. I'm very pleased to have the privilege of chairing this meeting tonight with three excellent speakers, all of whom I've known for some time in different contexts, talking about not only the current situation in terms of Russia's criminal invasion and war against Ukraine, but also looking at some of the broader issues surrounding the war, and also looking at what solidarity the left in Britain and indeed internationally, because I see we have comrades from other countries joining us tonight, should be showing to the Ukrainian resistance. We have such excellent speakers that you don't need to hear a lot from me, so I'm very pleased to welcome our speakers, Simon, Andy and Yuliya. And Simon is going to kick us off. Simon Pirani has been an expert on these political questions for some time. He's the author of Changing Putin's Russia and other books and articles on Russia, Ukraine, and particularly the labor movement. And I would strongly recommend that people look at his blog, People and Nature, which carries a lot of up-to-date information, both about the political situation, but also about concrete initiatives of solidarity. Over to you, Simon.
Thanks, Terry, and thanks for that kind introduction, and thanks to everybody for yet again gathering on this horrible Zoom machine that we've all had to become used to. And great to see Yuliya here from Ukraine. I'm going to talk about basically two bits to try to help us reflect on what's actually going on. The first is about the causes of the war and how we've reached this point, and the second is about at least some of the consequences which are already coming into view. About the causes, I'm sure Yuliya will say more to us about the character of this war. It's an aggressive war, it's an imperialist war. It's also, very importantly, I think, and this is very clear from these incredible photographs from the eastern areas of Ukraine, which are Russian-speaking areas, of these people demonstrating day after day with Ukrainian flags against this invasion. It's very clearly a war on people, and I think that's important to understand. The causes, as Terry mentioned, I actually hate that word expert. It always makes me scared. But I am somebody who's traveled to the region since Soviet times, both Russia and Ukraine, and written about the region. I mean, my understanding of Putinism, I would describe that as compensating for economic weakness of Russia with military strength and imperial expansion. We saw in 2014 with the Russian support for the so-called People's Republics in Donetsk and Luhansk, and also the annexation of Crimea, we saw those economic goals sacrificed in order to pursue military and imperial ambitions and to stoke up nationalism at home. Now, what we've seen last month is a much greater leap in that direction, which, again, talking about experts, I mean, anybody who claimed to know anything about the area did not accept that this was going to happen. Only very, or rather, that's not true. I mean, a very small number of people did say that there could be a full-scale invasion. I thought it was unlikely, but possible. And I thought it was unlikely because of the damage which had been done in 2014 to the economy, and the much greater damage that is being done to it now, to Russia's economy. So, I mean, one of the contradictions is here are representatives of the ruling class of capital who've essentially decided that economic growth and all that stuff really doesn't, and making money really doesn't matter at the moment. So why is that? The West's part in this dynamic is often described in terms of NATO expansion threatening Russia and Russian policies being a response. And I want to argue that, first of all, that's politically problematic. And we've all been at those meetings when people go on about NATO expansion, and you have to say, well, hang on a minute, it's actually Russian soldiers who are killing people, destroying their homes, driving them out of their towns in their millions, and bombing buildings, sheltering children. But it's not only politically and I mean, I basically think that's to do with the legacy of Stalinism in the workers' movement, but it's not only politically problematic, it is actually analytically problematic. And I would argue that as follows, that the 1990s brought an unprecedented economic collapse in Russia and in Ukraine, and both economies essentially were integrated into the world economy, essentially as suppliers of raw materials, oil, gas and minerals and metals, steel, particularly from Russia, steel and agricultural goods, particularly wheat and sunflower oil from Ukraine. And at that time, when the Russian economy was in a mess, when the state was in a mess, it didn't effectively collect taxes, it wasn't able to control the mainly Russian, not foreign, the mainly Russian business groups that took control of the most valuable assets out of the ruins of the Soviet system. And it's to that period, really, that NATO expansion belongs. Hungary, Poland, and Czech joined NATO in 1999, and 7 more countries went on the, I can't remember what the thing is called, but basically the kind of membership application process in 1999, and then joined in 2004. And there's been no NATO expansion since then, except for 3 small Balkan countries that have joined in the aftermath of the Balkan Wars. So, of course, there was NATO expansion at that time. I mean, politically, again, the people who talk about it don't mention the fact that there's an East European agency here. You know, it's not all dreamt up in the Pentagon. You know, if you were in the government of one of the Baltic states, whatever the political coloring, you're not worried about getting invaded by the United States as they are in Mexico. You're worried about getting invaded by Russia, or getting sold off to Russia by a deal with Nazi Germany, which of course is what happened to the Baltic states. So then that's the 1990s. If we go on to the 2000s, we have Putin. In his first 2 terms, there was an oil price boom, unprecedented, and this became, that's now turned out to have become the high point of Russian capitalism and the Putin model in terms of expanding those oil and gas exports and using the revenues. And although vast sums of hundreds of millions of dollars have gone into all kinds of offshore accounts, Putin did alter the balance of power as far as business and government was concerned. He arrested some of the oligarchs, exiled a couple more, and made the rest pay some tax. And on that basis, began to re-establish, if you like, the strong Russian state. And the other basis for the re-establishment of the strong Russian state was the murderous Second Chechen War between 2000 and 2002, supported by NATO, and cementing Putin and his team in power. Now, politically, from that time, it's clear that the relationship between the NATO powers, the Western powers, and Russia was not one where one side was expanding at the expense of the other, but where one stronger side, the Western side, was using Putin and his team as a gendarme, effectively, to govern the former Soviet space, and also to do things in the Middle East. And despite the constant denials, that's the relationship, spheres of influence. And when we get to 2014, the overthrow of Yanukovych in Ukraine, driven by a huge social movement, there's then a response by the Kremlin. And I would argue that's first of all an imperial response, that Ukraine is Russia's oldest colony, just as Ireland is England's oldest colony. But it's also a fear of that popular movement, which was confused, was politically heterogeneous, was all over the place, but was a popular movement. And it was not a coup, as is sometimes claimed. So I think the Russian response it has to be explained in those terms. And indeed, that nationalism, I had this conversation, which I always remember with, because I went around for like 3 or 4 years afterwards, asking every Russian I met, well, what was all that about? What was the point? Especially these business people who I engaged with when I was working at the Institute for Energy Studies in Oxford. And, you know, they all hated it because of the sanctions. And I was saying, what's going on? And the best explanation I ever heard is, you know, Putin could not go down as the person who'd had the chance to make trouble for Ukraine at that point and not taken it, because of the powerful nationalist lobby in the state and amongst the former security services officers that are around him. Now, those events came at a period when Russian capitalism was slipping, the boom was running out of steam, the effects of the 2008-9 crisis, which took quite a while to feed through because the oil prices remained high for a couple of years after that. But once those effects have fed through, living standards were declining in Russia for the first time under Putin, and this boom of nationalism created by the annexation of Crimea was a welcome thing for him and his team politically, coming as it did after. I mean, there were big protests in Russia, biggest protest movement really of the post-Soviet period in 2011-12. So those are some of the factors that produced that reaction. Now,
you've had 10, Simon.
Oh, right, okay. So let's get on then to. So I think, and I mean, as I said, I think that then is that what we have from 2014 to now is that kind of spheres of influence thing, and then last month it's a breakdown of all those relationships, the relationship between Russia and the Western powers, between Russia and its own people, and of course between Russia and Ukraine. Now, so just quickly, we can come back to this in the discussion. I mean, the sanctions are very serious. They are not like the 2014 sanctions. The central bank is going to struggle to get hold of its own money. The departure of the oil companies from Russia is an enormous thing. BP is writing off, $25 billion. Even for them, that's a fair bit of cash. The German foreign policy has undergone the biggest reversal of the post-Soviet period. Now, what is going to be the effect of that, which I think we can call economic warfare? There will be a reduction of oil exports by Russia. I think much more serious will be the reduction of Russian gas exports to Europe, which is a really key business for them. And I think that the disruption to the exports of wheat and sunflower oil, although they're a small proportion of total world output, for Egypt and Turkey in particular, this is a disaster. Apparently the price of bread has gone up in the Lebanon in the last month by 70%. I think that whatever happens, I'd be interested to hear what Yuliya thinks about the prospects for any kind of peace deal. I can't even see where one is coming from at the moment. But even if one did, the Russian economy is going to go into stagnation and much more likely a prolonged recession. And the final point, Terry, just to end on, and it's not something I'm going to have time to comment on, but it's, I think, a central part of this picture, is that the whole policy discussion now in Europe and here is about reducing dependence on Russian fossil fuels. Of course, Russia is the second after the United States producer of both oil and gas at the moment. And a really key question is whether that can be turned into a discussion about reduction on fossil fuels in general, and whether are we seeing a real crisis of neoliberalism, which gives us a chance to raise some of the policy issues surrounding climate change on the back of this situation. I'm not particularly optimistic. I noticed that Boris Johnson says, right, this gives us a reason to open up North Sea oil fields, complete load of old rubbish. It takes 5 or 6 years to get an oil field going. Well, what else would you expect from him? But I mean, I do think that space is opened up for that conversation, and the Labour movement needs to get its head around that. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Simon. So our second speaker tonight, find my notes, is Andy Kilminster. Andy's a member of Anti-Capitalist Resistance in Oxford and a member of the editorial board of Journal of Contemporary Central and Eastern Europe, one of the successors to a journal that I massively miss, Labour Focus on Eastern Europe. Andy, over to you.
Thanks very much, Terry. And before I start, I should say that I'm in no way an expert on Ukraine, although I have worked on Eastern Europe, as Terry said, for a number of years. And much of what I've learnt about Ukraine has come from Simon and from Yuliya, and also from other people like Marco Boychin and Christopher Ford, who have been connected with the journal that I used to edit over the years. So I see my role here is not to talk about the detail of what's going on in Ukraine at the moment, but to try and draw out some general points from the work from which I've learned. And I really want to just say 3 things. The first thing is national liberation matters. It matters to us as socialists fundamentally because it's a democratic right, and our socialism is rooted in democracy, and you can't have democracy when there is national oppression. You can't have democracy either in the oppressed nation or in the oppressor nation. It's an old cliche that we used to talk about, that no nation that oppresses another can itself be free. But the fact that it's a cliche doesn't mean that it isn't true. In our politics, we've taken that up with regard to Ireland, we've taken it up with regard to Catalonia, we've taken it up innumerable times in the global south, and we've also taken it up over the years in Eastern Europe, both during the Stalinist communist period and since the fall of Stalinism in the late 80s and early 90s. And it's been particularly important, I think, in Eastern Europe to take up the issue of national oppression. And there are many reasons for that, but one of them, which came out strongly, I think, in what Simon was saying, and also in some of the work which Jamie Goff has been writing recently on Ukraine, and which we've got on the Anti-Capitalist website, is that national oppression in Eastern Europe comes out of the weaknesses of the states and the economies in that region, and particularly the national oppression that is coming from Russia at the moment, directed against Ukraine, but also against a number of other countries in the region, comes out of the weakness of the Russian state, the weakness of the Russian economy, the weakness of the Russian ruling class. That ruling class doesn't have the sophisticated economic and related kinds of means of establishing domination that countries like the United States have. It relies to a much greater degree on brute force. And we're seeing that brute force being exerted in Ukraine at the moment. We saw a similar kind of brute force exerted by the Milosevic regime in Serbia in the early 1990s. And that's a characteristic of national chauvinism in the region that's been current, as I say, throughout the Stalinist period, or through much of the Stalinist period and the post-Stalinist period. It's an interesting question that we could take up in the discussion, to what extent there is continuity here and to what extent there's change. I think there are elements of both. To some degree, the kind of approach that is being taken by Putin now is rooted in the Stalinist politics of the past. To some degree, it's new. That's something we can take up in the discussion, but I won't dwell on that in detail here. The second point that I want to make is that for us as socialists, national liberation matters, but it's not the only thing that matters. We see the national question as being connected in a myriad of ways with many other oppressions: class oppression, gender oppression, environmental degradation. And that means that when we analyze what's going on in a war like the war in Ukraine, we have to look at the full complexity of the situation, at all of the kinds of determinations that are taking place, not just the national issue, but how that intersects with class, gender, ecological questions. Following on from that, a war like the war in Ukraine has many different characters. It is, to a large degree, a war of national liberation. But as Simon has said in one of the articles on his blog, it's both a war between states and it's a people's war. It's a war of national liberation, but it's also, in a sense, a war between imperialist countries. The United States is involved, albeit by proxy. The EU is involved, albeit by proxy. So we have to analyze this war in all of its different complexities. And I'll just mention, one example from the tradition from which anti-capitalist resistance comes, of that kind of analysis, the analysis that Ernest Mandel gave of the Second World War, which he, I argued, had 5 different characters. Now, I'm not necessarily standing for every element of that analysis or for the way in which Mandel tried to pull those 5 different characters together, just using that as an example of how, in the complexity of this kind of situation, wars can't just be seen as one, having one character, but they have multiple determinations, multiple complexities. Now, what I've said so far, I think, is fairly common currency. It's fairly uncontroversial. The third point I want to make is perhaps slightly more controversial on the left. And that is that while we look at the complexities and the multiple characters of a war like the war in Ukraine at the moment, not every character, not every aspect of that war is of equal importance. We need, as Marxists, to look at what is the driving force behind that war, what is the key contradiction that lies behind it, and to work from that through to a concrete analysis of all the other things that are going on. And for me, the key contradiction, as Simon stated very clearly,
Has everybody else lost, Andy?
We were about to hear what the key contradiction was.
Possibly the worst time.
Is the capitalist class conspiracy? They have shut him off. They don't want us to know.
It's
let's give
Putin.
it-
It's
it'll
Putin.
Try recontacting him and then
Hang
telling him
on,
to keep.
hang on. I'm just trying to work out what's going on because he was here.
It said on my screen, Andy Kilminster left.
Okay, so he's gonna. Okay, because I don't know how long he's going to be, I'm going to ask Yuliya to start, and then we'll take.
Let's give it a minute, and if people can use this minute to type their questions if they have formulated any, and if he's not back in a minute or two, then
Okay.
we can rethink.
No, I agree. I'm really hanging on this every word, but what a pain.
My editing skills will come into use later, so I'll edit out the interlude.
But this, I think it's significant. The contradiction is so crucial that it can kick you out of Zoom. I mean, it's allegorical and symbolic. I like it.
I don't. I want to know what he was going. I mean,
I'm obviously I'm trying to humor the situation.
I think we'll have to roll on, Terry, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Sorry, Yuliya. Over to you.
Oh, no worries. I'm sorry that that Andy got broken at such a crucial point in his talk. But yeah, I think if we want to talk about contradictions of capitalism and the way that they systematically express themselves, what is happening in Ukraine now is one of those crucial things. And it's great to be sharing this panel with Simon and Andrew because my first ever published piece was in Debatte in the Journal of Central and Eastern Europe. So we kind of go way back. It was my last year of finishing PhD when I've sent him the piece. So it's there is also a sentimental value to this meeting, which is quite interesting. It makes you reflect on what has happened in those, what is it now, almost 10 years, right? So without any further ado, I'm going to jump into what I want to add to this conversation. And it's kind of good to go at the end because you can build up on what other people were saying. And some of the questions that I want to speak to, and just to clarify, I have 15, right, Harry? Yeah. Yes, I'm going to time myself. I want to speak to the questions of sovereignty and self-determination, to the question, or to the permanent, to kind of this pertinent and eternal question on what is to be done, and specifically in the current situation, and not least in terms of achieving peace, and on what terms can a meaningful Marxist peace be established, or rather, workers' peace can be established in Ukraine. So what we have seen when we talk about questions of sovereignty and self-determination and the national question, I'm quite glad that Andrew raised it. We talk about something much bigger than declarations of independence and being recognized by the UN as an independent state. We recognize that there is, as Andrew was saying, there is this, when any specific nation, a political nation, civic nation has sovereignty and fights for its national liberation, it's also fighting against oppressions along the lines of class, sex, gender, race, and any other levels of oppression that exist in that society and their intersections. And what we have seen in Ukraine by now already is violation and intensification of a lot of those oppressions, not least because of the suffering and disruption of war, and because large amounts of people are being displaced. So I'm not even talking people in direct conflict, but those who are fleeing conflict. We have seen reports of trafficking, of rape, of racist abuse, and of course, there will be, and there already are, a lot of tensions and oppressions of those people who have fled and who are running out of means of being exploited as this desperate reserve army of labor in various European countries predominantly. We've already seen tensions in Poland, for example, between migrant workers and those who have arrived. Like, actually, we have a personal anecdote. So a relative's mother just came back from Poland. She was working in a warehouse there, like, like a type of Google kind of warehouse, not Google, type of Amazon kind of delivery warehouse. And she's left because of the influx of people. Their wages dropped 2 to 3 times, and like, it's not economical for her to stay there anymore. So there are all of these tensions already arising. We have seen in the UK the signals from Priti Patel that Ukrainian workers are welcome in the farms, in the farming sector of the UK, and there will be kind of expedited routes for them, and that again creates this kind of tensions of labor. But it's just kind of as some of the consequences of the conflict. But coming back to what is going on in Ukraine and why we are having why this war has happened and what exactly is going on the ground. I agree to what Simon was saying and what Andrew also has spoken to about Russian neo-imperialistic aggression being something that is a sign of economic weakness and is being expressed as a military power. There are all of these oppressed Russians apparently everywhere. That is a complete fabrication, and it's and what Putin's regime is doing is like it's conducting a politics of some sort of offended Nazism, like where this nation of offended by the world people who have to establish ourselves, and a lot of that, of course, is a diversion tactic, creation of an enemy abroad and an enemy within, to an extent, to divert attention of an everyday Russian and of the world's population and analysts from the damage to the Russian economy that has already been made by previous conflicts, but also by kleptocracy, by mismanagement, by embezzlement, and general mismanagement of the Russia's economy since the USSR fell apart. So in a lot of senses, it's a very stupid war because the damage to the Russian economy will be palpable for decades after. And the Russia's behavior towards Ukraine can be best understood, and I agree with Oksana Shavel, excellent Ukraine scholar, with this. It's like it's best seen through the frame of domestic violence and narcissism, where some self-perceived traumatized egos are hitting the weak around them so that they feel stronger and kind of and empowered and in their own way and in their own feet. So what Russian political discourse inside the country and internationally is signaling us is that there is a lot of politics of gaslighting, because there is no justifiable reason, and there wasn't any justifiable reason to invade Ukraine, and thence we have this kind of changing goalposts and about forsaken promises amidst the rhetoric of common history and destiny that sound really cheap and evoke no trust. And we see the kind of every time Russia is coming to the negotiating table, and the only reason they're coming to the negotiating table with Ukraine now is because Ukraine is getting military advantage. It's like they're coming with a different list of demands. So like they can't decide themselves. They can't agree on why they are in this war, what they want, like what are the goals of any of this, because there haven't been any clearly defined goals to begin with. The West and the NATO also partly responsible in a lot of this, and I will come back to that in a minute when I get to kind of what is to be done question. NATO itself has shown a lot of weaknesses, because like to me it looks by now more like a trade union for selling weapons to be exploded somewhere else and sold somewhere else. But when smaller states who have joined NATO in Central and Eastern Europe have done that to not least and predominantly to avoid being attacked by Russia, they are now all realizing that the Article 5 most likely will not be triggered for them. And in that sense, I'm actually quite glad that this kind of exposure of the fakeness of this kind of protective union is showing itself, because Central Eastern European states are now rethinking, and every other small state should be rethinking what kind of international security architecture should be in place and what kind of protections and securities should there be in place for them to actually not be attacked. And I'll again come back to that in a minute. So this war is symbolic. There is no justification for it, and there was already kind of from before, even before it broke in earnest. There were, like, through the media and through politicians' speeches, there was a scene being set for abandonment of Ukraine and giving it up to Russia. And again, this is what a lot of other smaller states are realizing, that they are pawns in big geopolitical games, and a lot of cosmopolitan international politics and international order is more of a pretense than actually a meaningful international security system. Because we have seen these kind of, you know, remember in a few months ago, this talks about if there is a minor incursion, maybe there will be sanctions, but if there is a major incursion, maybe there will be something else. Well, like, but how much of national sovereignty is it okay to violate for that to be not considered a violation of international law? What is all this talk? You know, it's absolutely nonsensical. If we were talking about Britain or Germany or the United States, we wouldn't be talking about minor and major incursions. But countries like Ukraine can be, of course, treated like that. And we have seen more recently this kind of the suspicions that a lot of Ukrainians and Ukrainian scholars of Ukraine rather, and Russia, we have seen those worries going to materialize when the sell-off of Ukraine, when Ukraine's ambassador to Germany, Melnik, has given an interview a few days ago to Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung, and he said that in the first day of war, when he arrived to the finance minister of Germany to ask for support, he was met with a quiet smile and with a statement that, well, you know, there is no point issuing you any aid, because in a couple of days it will all be over and we will have to get used to the new order of things. This is the kind of preparation and preparedness of defending Ukraine that we had from our Western partners, who have been sending weapons to Ukraine and training Ukrainian army in the interim years without any intention of actually meaningfully supporting Ukraine should Russia invade. And that is outrageous. It's not sadly surprising to me, but it is not outrageous. And now Russia is using all sorts of dirty tactics, including nuclear threat and gas war tactics that it used against Ukraine before, shutting down the gas pipe, that it's now using against European countries. And they're acting really surprised. And all of a sudden, you know, Scholz sees Russia for what it is, which is a country in an imperialistic war, because they, for some reason, thought that Russia will behave in a specific way towards Ukraine, but it won't towards its German partners. Well, why wouldn't it? And of course it would. So similarly now what we see is that, you know, Russia, of course, is violating a lot of international laws, and this war is neo-imperialistic and it's neo-colonial in a lot of senses. And so that's the kind of the general nature of Russian invasion. But of course, the reasoning of this war is more complex than a sheer fight for might. And I think like Simon has spoken quite a bit to that. So the last 5 minutes that I want to focus on is what is actually right now happening. What is the cost of this invasion so far? What is to be done by us on the left, by activists, by scholars, and what is to be done on the political terrain. So first of all, what we are seeing is, to an extent, this kind of, you know, there is this kind of normalization of invasion, and we've seen a bit of a turn in negotiations about somehow Russia retreating to where it was before February 24. Well, if it's February 24 of 2004, I really don't mind. But if it's February 24 of this year, no, thank you very much. We have had 8 years of negotiations around occupied Donbass areas and around occupied Crimea. We have got absolutely nowhere, and we have given Russia time to regroup and to attack yet again. Russia has to be fought, and it has to be, this war has to be won militarily by Ukrainian army with financial and military assistance of anybody who's willing to. This is my position, and this is the position of Sotsialny, Rukh, with who we have a lot of these conversations on a regular basis. What we also need to be, so normalization of this conflict and this invasion and the kind of the selling off of Ukraine that a lot of Western politicians have been trying to do, that needs to be resisted and exposed on all possible fronts. Because the thing is that Russia will not stop in Ukraine. All imperial powers who are violating international law and who are not respecting sovereignty of other states have to be punished. And Russia's imperialistic ambition needs to be tamed. It needs to be broken, and Russia needs to pay for what it has done. Of course, there are, the next thing that we need to be resistant is the politics of whataboutism. And Simon spoke to that already. There is all of these talks about like how there is NATO there involved, and there is the Azov battalions, nationalists, some of them are Nazis, and that, Crimea used to be part of Russia at some point, and that Russian language is supposedly oppressed in Ukraine, even though half of its parliament still can't speak proper Ukrainian. All of that nonsense, that is just distraction that needs to be resisted. Those conversations are important, but those are marginal factors in what is going on right now. So whataboutism need to be resisted in all possible ways. There are intersections of various factors, but first and foremost, we need to be talking about Russian neo-imperialism and Ukraine's resistance in the context of decolonization, including fight for autonomous identity and de-Russification. Because not everything is unfair about Russophobia right now in Ukraine. I'm sorry, Ukrainians have every reason to hate Russians right now. And lecturing somebody whose house has just been bombed and whose wife has just been raped about how they should love Russians, I think is callous is the most polite way I can put it, and grotesque and all the rest of it. So we need to differentiate between outright Nazi Russophobia and xenophobia and a righteous rage against the invader. So what is to be done economically? If I can claim 3 more minutes, Terry?
Would I dare say no?
I'm totally abusing this, but yeah, when else can I abuse this? I'm in the war zone, right? So how Ukraine can be held beyond the correct framing of the narrative of what is going on in Ukraine, that again, has suffered over 3 centuries of Russification of its culture and its life. So Ukraine has to be given security guarantees. The Ukrainian army should be given weapons. I am against NATO intervention, direct NATO intervention in this conflict. I am still against the no-fly zone because I know what happens when NATO planes are coming into the airspace. Every city will be like Mariupol, and I do not want that for Ukraine. But Ukrainian army, it has the zeal, it has the spirit, it has the skills. There are lots of personnel who are already conscribed, and those who are still willing to fight, and because every conscription point is oversubscribed. Give the weapons, give the air defense systems. Ukraine needs to militarily win this war. Negotiations, we tried 8 years, it doesn't work. Ukraine has to be defeated, Russia has to be defeated. Next, security guarantees has to be given. I don't think NATO is a good idea. And NATO has shown itself as a club for selling weapons more than ever before. But strong security guarantees need to be given to Ukraine, and there are short, medium, and long-term goals in that process that need to be achieved. So there needs to be an agreement where certain states who are powerful militarily are going to guarantee that Ukraine is not to be invaded. UN peacekeepers need to be brought in, and we need to be talking about different international security order where UN is democratized, Permanent Security Council is disbanded altogether. There is horizontalization and more power to protect states who have been invaded, and those countries who are launching aggression against somebody else get suspension of their voting rights. Nobody gets a veto. Those are just some kind of broad ideas. Next, what needs to happen is that Ukrainian independence is also independence and sovereignty and ability to reconstruct itself economically. Ukraine is a heavily indebted country, and it's the poorest country in Europe. It was before the war. By now, over $1 trillion in losses, in destruction to the economic infrastructure has been sustained, and that's an underestimation. This is just over a month in. EBRD has issued around $2 billion in grants, and IMF has issued the emergency financing mechanism, 1.4 billion, and that's the maximum that they can do. That is peanuts, right? What we need is reassignment of special drawing rights to Ukraine. We need grants. We need writing off of its debt, and I'm involved in a lot of this campaign, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And it needs to be also done, this kind of debt reorganization needs to be done carefully so that default is not triggered, because it's not just IMF or ECB debt. There is private debt, and it's more strict in terms of what you can and cannot do when you are canceling. So that needs to be carefully thought through. The trade relations relations with the EU have to be seriously reconsidered. There needs to be exceptions made to state budgetary allocations, and there needs to be a space created for Ukraine to act as a developmental state, and there needs to be a lot of international, so there needs to be an emergency redrafting for certain kind of rules of engagement of the Deep Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement between Ukraine and the EU that, of course, prescribes politics of austerity and strict budgetary restrictions on what can and cannot money be spent on. That needs to be changed so that Ukraine can function as a developmental state as other states functioned after the reconstruction, after the post-Second World War reconstruction. There needs to be a large macroeconomic assistance fund created with international money being put in, not just money from Russian private and state funds, but also from other international partners who have been like whistling for the last 8 years. These sanctions and repercussions for Russia, they should have been triggered 8 years ago, not now. This current escalation in this war would have been would have been preventable, and it would have been prevented should there have been an adequate response, and it wasn't. And so how I frame it, call it macroeconomic assistance, but I see it as international reparations for Ukraine being thrown to the dogs. And that needs to, Ukraine should not be left to fend for itself in this situation. And that money can come again from private and from state funds and from different governments, not least through through donating special drawing rights and through the rules of engagement with IMF being redrafted a bit. And of course, what we also need, like there is a talk about repossessing the assets of Russian oligarchs and using some of that money towards rebuilding Ukraine. Well, I don't want to stop at Russian oligarchs. All oligarchic enterprises in Ukraine should be passed into collective ownership and management of those people who work in those enterprises, so that there is no tax evasion and avoidance, so that those who are working in those enterprises are masters of their destiny and of what's happening in those enterprises. They will be interested in developing those enterprises, they will be paying taxes, and they will have decent wages and decent pensions. So if EU wants to support Ukraine in its de-oligarchization effort, which it says it does through all of these different agreements, well, allow us to take what has been stolen for the last 30 years. And that, yes, it does also include certain reorganization of engagement with Western companies in Ukraine and clamping down on offshores internationally, because Ukrainian oligarchs didn't invent offshores. They're using them. They were created on the fringes of British Empire and other empires so that the money can be hidden from labor by capital of other countries internationally, and that has to be addressed. I think this war and the kind of the peacemaking of it, and the reconstruction fund restructuring and certain redrafting of international rules should be used as a historic opportunity to change the balance of power between labor and capital in the international architecture, from tax evasion to international security order. That needs to happen. I have big dreams. What can I say? I'm going to stop at that, and yeah, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And I hope that Andrew came back.
Thank you so much, Yuliya, and I hope the meeting will not chide me too much for letting Yuliya finish her contribution, because we don't get the opportunity to hear a voice from Ukraine itself often enough when we discuss the political situation that's been going on. So what I propose to do, I think if I'm going to try and take a bunch of questions. If Andy wants to come in and finish his contribution at some point, he's very welcome. So if people want to speak, I'm going to try and restrict people to 3 minutes so we can get as many people in as possible. And I'm going to try and take 3 or 4 questions and then bring the panel back and then take another round, because I think that's more fluid while people are okay. I've got Dan, And then I've
So
got
we'll let Andrew finish his contradiction for us.
Do you
Want
want?
to know that biggest contradiction?
Does he want to finish that first, Terry, or am I?
I'm really sorry. I lost connection. So many apologies for that. I think it would be better to do what Terry just suggested and go on to the discussion now. And I'll be very happy to contribute to that.
okay. So over to you, Dan.
Cheers, Terry. Basically, I won't focus on the actions of Russia too much because there seems to be general agreement on that so far in terms of, the imperialist aggression for them and the rationale for what they did. However, in terms of security guarantees from powerful states, which would presumably be other powerful imperialist states, I don't really get that because, like, if you look at the actions of like Western imperialism since World War II, obviously they've killed far more, millions more people than anyone else, and obviously recently in Afghanistan, Iraq, at the moment in a proxy type war in Yemen. And how would you get security guarantees of countries which are prepared to carry out the actions that they have, and what would those security guarantees like even mean? Like I don't think that they could be trusted in any sense. They would only implement security guarantees if it was in the interest of Western imperialism. So I just wondered more what was meant by that. And in terms of ironically, what Putin used as an excuse in terms of NATO expansionism for the imperialist invasion has now actually probably united NATO in a way that it wasn't before this war, has strengthened NATO, and as obviously now you're seeing countries saying they want to join NATO, that they want to increase military spending, and NATO in terms of an imperialist power and an issue is probably, it's like what will come out of this from a point of view of being worried about Western imperialism is more of an issue now than before. Like, I think there were a lot, NATO in many ways was creaking at the seams, and from the point of view of like, obviously while this war is going on, sorry Tara, I finished. While this war is going on, we should focus on solidarity with the Ukrainian resistance. But I also think, given this growing propaganda about NATO, if you are socialists in Western countries, we also have to campaign against this growing propaganda about NATO as some kind of democratic liberal force, when obviously we all know it's not. So while we do need to focus on the resistance in Ukraine, I do think that this is a big issue in Western countries that also needs to be grappled with in terms of fighting back about what NATO really is. But anyway, sorry, Terry, I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Dan. I've got Stephanie, David and Roland, and then I'm going to bring the panel back, and then I've got Pat and myself on a second list. Steph?
Thank you. I take the point that we don't want to dwell on the sort of whatabouts about nationalism, etc. But I was struck by what Yuliya was saying about the role of Western imperialism and its responses to requests for support. And so my question, I did put it in the chat, but I suppose it's essentially, has that had an effect on the approach and the views that are being expressed by the resistance about, can we go it alone, nationalism, etc. And the sort of corollary to that is sort of how strong are socialist voices within the resistance that's taking place at the moment, because that's really what what we need. Obviously, it's a we describe it as a popular sort of resistance, but what's that balance of forces if you can describe it politically at the moment? Thank you.
Thanks, Steph. David?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about what sort of anti-war movement we should build in this country and internationally now, because
Louder.
I want to talk about the anti-war movement and how there are problems with building this anti-war movement in this country, because we got a situation where Stop the War movement, which is a historic movement around the war questions, will not organize a demonstration unless it's on the demands that they want, which includes stuff about NATO, stuff which excludes solidarity with resistance and not sending arms, all that sort of stuff. That's fine. They won't agree to organizing with other forces active like the UCS and other people around three basic demands. So a few of us got together, us from the ACR and Mike Phipps from Labour Hub, to organize an appeal which has already been signed by a number of personalities and activists in the movement, calling for the organization of events and demonstrations around three simple demands that everybody can agree with, which are Russian troops out now, no to war, and refugees welcome. This seems to us a sufficient basis of demonstrations. Everybody can bring whatever other slogans they want to those demonstrations. So, for example, if we want to raise the question of solidarity resistance, arms of resistance, we can. If Stop the War and other people want to go on and on about NATO, fine, no problem. It seems to me this is the way to organize anti-war movements. This is what happened before over things like Ireland or Vietnam or other issues of international importance. People got together around a united campaign around things we agree on. It's incredible when the Stop the War people say, we cannot organize a demonstration that maybe Keir Starmer might support. Well, during the Stop the War movement on Iraq, they had people on their platform who were supporters of NATO, who weren't particularly on the left, but they thought it was a good thing for the movement. Today, because of their obsession with not seeming to be confronting Putin and being anti-NATO, they won't consider doing this. It seems to be absolutely terrible. And I'll add another thing. I find it quite distasteful that if you look at Stop the War website, there's hardly any articles, in empathy or sympathizing or being disgusted or being critical of the killing going on by Putin. If you compare that to what they did on other questions in Iraq, it's just completely different. I can't imagine that a thing like Fallujah during the Iraq war, they wouldn't do, they did stuff on that. They're not doing anything about that now. All they're talking about is Russia-phobia, NATO and the rest of it. So that's, I want to see what the panel thinks about that. The things on the chat, by the way, the notes were on Ukraine, it's on the chat.
Thanks, Dave. Roland?
Thanks. Yuliya spoke a couple of times about the need for a Ukrainian military victory and a Russian military defeat. And I'd like to know concretely what that means, because it looks as though the Russian army is having far less success than they initially expected, that they're bogged down and they can't make much advance at the moment. It also looks from reports that I've read that having intimidated his advisors into giving him the advice that he wanted, he's now criticizing them for lying to him about how easy it would be. And in it, I mean, do you think that the current stage at which Ukraine has clearly proved resistant to an easy Russian invasion, does this count as a Russian military victory, a Ukrainian military victory, or do you think it needs to be a much more clear smashing of the Russian army? Because, for instance, in Vietnam, the American army was not smashed. They were forced into a situation in which they couldn't win an easy victory. Because my concern is that if we're talking about an absolutely explicit defeat of the Russian army, Putin has got biological, chemical and nuclear weapons that he could unleash. He may well be using some of them already anyway. I'm not sure, and you probably know, have information about this, but I'd like to know specifically what you mean and at what stage it would be apparent that it's a Russian military defeat and a Ukrainian military victory.
Thanks, Roland. Okay, I'm going to ask the panel to come back at this point and then take a second list. If you want to be on that list, put your hand up as the panel are coming back. So I'll take the panel in the same order. Simon, do you have any?
Yeah, thanks, Terry. I mean, there's a lot of questions about that are thrown up by the war that I find it extremely difficult to answer, and I think we don't have the answers. I think the issues raised by Daniel about what could these security guarantees possibly mean.
don't believe this. Putin's on this bloody call.
It's FSB.
Indeed. Andy, do you want to have a go? Are you still with us?
I'll have a go. Two things really that I would say. I mean, as with Simon, there are a lot of questions that I wouldn't have answers to, but I think what the war is doing is raising those questions, and they're really important. And there are a number of things that have been deeply wrong and problematic in the international kind of system over the last 20 or 30 years of neoliberalism that the war is now forcing us to address. And I think there are two that are really important. One was raised by Simon and one was raised by Yuliya. Simon raised the issue of this kind of gendarme arrangement where Russia was given the go-ahead effectively to kind of police a certain region by the other imperialist powers, and allowed essentially to do what it liked in terms of crushing people in Grozny and elsewhere, so long as it kept that region safe for capital. And I think that arrangement has now broken down. That's a good thing that it's broken down, and we need to now enter into the debate about what would replace that internationally. And Yuliya raised important issues about
Okay, I've had a suggestion.
Security Council, the UN, and all of that I think are easy answers, but they're issues to debate. Simon the other thing that's been raised, of course, is the role of these oligarchs and oligarchical capitalism, both East and West. And some of the issues around, the measures around sanctions provide the basis for taking up some of those issues more broadly, not just with Russian oligarchs, but with Ukrainian oligarchs, with British oligarchs, with American oligarchs. Transparency, the attack on tax havens, all of those things that came up through the Panama Papers. So, I mean, those kinds of broader issues are coming out of the war. The other thing I would say something about is Dave's points about Stop the War Coalition. And this was really what I was going to talk about when I got cut off earlier. We need during a war to focus on the main contradiction, the main problem, and the main problem here, I think, is national oppression by Russia. And I think there are two kind of false responses to that, which we've seen on the left. One of which came out in a debate with Gilbert Ashkar and Alex Kalinikos from Kalinikos, which is really to say that everything that's going on is of equal importance. This is an inter-imperialist war, and it's also a war of national liberation, and they're both of equal status. So basically, we can't give arms or call for arms or sanctions in support of Ukraine because it's inter-imperialist. All we can do is give sympathy. That's wrong. We need to go for the main contradiction, the key thing, and focus in, as Dave said, on very simple demands. The other mistaken response, I think, which we've seen from some elements on the left to what's going on, is to feel that because in global terms, the United States is stronger than Russia, the United States is manipulating events in every region. And that is not, I think, the case in this particular region. The driving force is coming from Russia. It isn't coming from the United States. It isn't coming from NATO. We want to call for the dissolution of NATO, but that is secondary. And that the key thing has to be the focus on those simple demands. The important ones were raised, I think, by Dave. There are some others that we could add to that, but keep that clear focus on the main contradiction, the main driving force of what's going on at the moment.
Thanks, Andy. Before I ask someone to come in again, can I ask everybody other than me and the speakers to turn their cameras off so we can see if that solves the curse of Zoom? Simon, did you want to finish your sentence?
No, I think go on, Terry. Well, I was going to try and say something about the anti-war movement, just really, really briefly, which is that I just think we get a distorted picture in the UK. I put something on my blog today about this convoy, which is being organised by Solidaire, which is the syndicalist union federation in France, and it's just obvious from that. And I mean, there's another convoy seems to be getting organised from Austria. I think it may be behind that, maybe a branch of what used to be the part of the Fourth International led by Nahuel Moreno in Argentina. I couldn't quite understand which particular grouping it was, but the point is, I mean, all these initiatives seem to have an enormous amount of weight behind them. There's a lot going on, and this is practical stuff. I mean, it's great to demonstrate, and I do it myself, but, you know, marching around in circles is not as good as taking stuff, getting in a bus or a train or a truck or a lorry and going over to Ukraine. So I think we've got this, you know, I think the things that people described about the Stop the War website and everything, I mean, I really do think is the sort of dregs of post-Stalinism. Right, and someone says, Peter's just said in the chat, there's convoys from this country too, absolutely. And a lot of people just get it. I mean, I know like several people who I study Russian with, a couple of them who, you know, they're not even particularly sort of labor movement types, got in their cars and drove over to the Polish border. All that's going on. And, you know, I think we should, if we're swimming too much in a pond with Stop the War, let's go somewhere else. I mean, I went up with a friend when the Ukrainian people on the first weekend were demonstrating in Trafalgar Square. I mean, like thousands of them, and quite a lot of Brits who were sort of, you know, married to Ukrainians or who just turned up or whatever, but no Brits with posters or sort of any indication that they're part of the organised labour movement. So we could try and get over that gap too.
Thanks, Simon. Yuliya?
Thank you. I'm going to try to combine questions and be as brief as possible so that more people can ask questions. So I think like a couple of things that were asked was kind of it's possible to combine. I second what Simon and Andrew were saying, that you know there is some shall we say disagreement on the Western left, whatever that means, as to whether Ukraine should be armed or not. And I think part of that comes from an inability to see that Ukraine is in the process of fighting its old imperial master. And you know, if it were a war that was happening somewhere in Latin America or in sub-Saharan Africa, we wouldn't be having these conversations, because those imperialisms are kind of a more clear cut in some people's eyes. Some still are seeing Russia as some sort of counterweight to the United States. They have failed to notice that in the last 30 years, Russia is not the USSR, and actually Russia never equaled USSR. But like, you know, there is that kind of maybe some sort of you know, romantic unwillingness to see Russia for what it actually is, which is a neo-imperialist power in a state of organizing decay that is grabbing on whatever it can in the process. And you know, like I saw some messages in the chat as well about like how sanctions are hurting irregular Russians. And that is horrendous, and I agree that that is horrendous. But you know what's more horrendous? Being raped for 3 days in front of your 6-year-old child and dying of wounds, and your child going grey. This is the story in the news today. So, you know, I feel for the regular Russians, but the thing is, like, you know, unless there is a kind of, you know, if sanctions were applied or something else was done 8 years ago, like, you know, it's, you know, I'm kind of, I have limited, but I have solidarity and sympathy with the labor in Russia, and like, you know, and also other people in neighboring countries who are relying on remittances from those who are working in Russia. It is really horrendous. But the thing is that unless Russia is stopped right now, that it will not be better. Those people were not living good lives to begin with. And you know, this is a painful rupture that we need to go through, and Ukraine is right now paying the price. Before that, it was Chechnya, there was Transnistria, there was Abkhazia. Who's next? Right, so that needs to happen. In terms of security guarantees and whether and what kind of victory should there be? Like, I agree that Ukraine doesn't have the army to push all the way to Moscow, nor is it necessarily kind of desirable. But the kind of a defeat in the sense that Russia retreats, not least because its economy is being crippled by sanctions, that is something that is feasible, I think, with enough military support of Ukraine and enough so that it can put enough of counter-offensive. And in terms of kind of arms supply, I'm talking about air defense systems. I'm talking about kind of those Stingers and Javelins and the rest of it, so that so that Ukraine can fight back and push back on Russian forces. That is feasible in my view, and in that sense that that when Russia has to accept defeat. That is something that is feasible, I think. And in terms of security guarantees, yes, of course, like there are some old imperial powers that themselves, are not necessarily quite willing, have themselves, their hands in blood and are not quite, the what are they, poster boys or girls or whatever else for good international conduct. But there is something that unites Ukraine and Britain and Germany and the United States right now, and that is the desire for Russia to disappear as an aggressor of the map. And in that sense, I think certain security guarantees can be gotten. And after that, if there is this kind of need for Russia, if Russia is put in a position where it has to accept defeat in this war, there will be an ability to push proper support through the UN, because I do not want NATO boots in Ukraine, but UN peacekeepers is a better idea, and that's in the short and midterm. And in the long term, we need to be talking about a different international security order that is more horizontal, as I kind of have spoken to already. About anti-war, I think it's not kind of necessarily too important, but I agree that the way that this whole military campaign will now go, I know that Russia has some really ugly weapons that they're not shy to use, and there are already cases, documented cases of them using there are reports, let's put it this way, of them using phosphorus bombs and cluster bombs in concrete places. So this is the kind of level of escalation that I do not want to see myself. But we're so deep into this conflict that I think without pushing Russia to sign a retreat militarily, we will not see the beginning or the end of any sort of reconciliation or peace.
Thank you, Yuliya. Okay, I'm going to take a final list now. So I've got Pat, myself, Pete, and Stefano and Fred, although Fred hasn't got his hand up, but I know he wants to come in. Pat?
Thanks, comrade. I'll make three hopefully quick points. Firstly, Simon Pirani put in the chat, I think a very important post about the Labour movement demo in London on Saturday the 9th of April. I think that's a really important development in terms of solidarity with Ukraine, in terms of an independent labour movement mobilisation. So I think that really should be something that comrades have a look at and try to support and try and get their sort of trade union branches on board with that and to attend if possible. Secondly, very quickly, I think, Andy, you were really clear about the issue of the rights of Ukraine to self-determination, and obviously Yuliya as well. So I 100%, and so therefore, if we're serious about that, then we should have, the left should be calling for arms for Ukraine. Otherwise it's just an abstract, nice words. If we're serious, let's be serious. So yeah, absolutely, and just thirdly, I'll be quick. My trade union branch, Northampton National Education Union, just very recently, just a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, passed a motion unanimously support for Ukraine, support for self-determination, no to Putin's war, support for the left and socialists and trade unionists in Ukraine, support for the anti-war movement in Russia. And certainly, it wasn't like, it wasn't controversial. The meeting 100% supported it. So we should be, I think, raising those points in the movement in our trade union branches. Thank you, comrades.
Thanks, Pat. A couple of things from me quickly. Firstly, I wanted to come back to the question that Simon raised in his introduction about the climate movement. I mean, clearly in Britain, as you say, it's no surprise that Johnson is using the Ukraine crisis to talk about all sorts of nonsense, not only the expansion of North Sea oil exploration, but today the government agreed to lift the instruction on the fracking companies in Lancashire to concrete over the wells. And of course, there's this supposed row, which we think is behind the delay in the energy white paper, around supposedly small new modular, none of which actually does anything to improve the lack of dependence on Russian oil. And we also see Biden using the whole thing cynically to up the export of LPG from the US. But I do think it is important that the climate movement has been taking some initiatives around this and that we continue to do it. I'm interested to know from Yuliya whether there are what she knows about XI Ukraine, which made some important demands on the climate movement internationally at the beginning of the war. And I'd be interested in hearing more about that. And then finally, I do think the question of cancellation of Ukrainian debt is something, I mean, actually the whole question of cancellation of the debt generally is something that the left in Britain has been phenomenally weak on historically. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about that in your concluding remarks in terms of where we are with that campaign and how we could build that along with other initiatives comrades have spoken about. Pete?
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to make a couple of points about the anti-war movement here. Dave Kellaway spoke about the initiative taken by Mike Phipps and him and others in terms of a statement. The problem is, I think, that it's not going to get the purchase that we would want it to do. I mean, I've signed it. But I was on the Stop the War demonstration and on the London Stands with Ukraine demonstration last weekend. And the contrast between the two was absolute. The Stop the War demonstration had about 3,000 people on, no Ukrainian flags, a couple of trade union banners. The London Stands with Ukraine demonstration, lots of Ukrainian flags, quite a few Belarusian flags and anti-war Russian flags, no trade union presence and very little left presence other than Ukraine Solidarity Campaign and a couple of others. And it was like never the two will meet. And that's the reaction to this statement as well, that a whole layer of the left is saying we can't touch this with a barge pole because it doesn't talk about NATO. Now, I mean, I think we should all talk about NATO, but it doesn't have to be a prerequisite of that statement. In terms of the Labour movement demonstration on the 9th of April, there's already problems because on the leaflet it says initiative taken by a PCS union. And I'm told that Mark Sirocco, the General Secretary of PCS Union, is already getting cold feet because of pressure from the Socialist Party and others. Some of us know that the General Secretary of the Fire Brigades Union, one of the best unions politically, has the same position as Stop the War on this, is against arming the Ukrainians, let alone getting arms from wherever they can, and so on. So there are real problems in terms of building a serious anti-war movement in this country. And you know, I think that's a problem that we need to address. I mean, the big dividing line, I think, between those of us here, if you like, and Stop the War is not just sort of what you say about NATO, but is actually the agency of the Ukrainians. They oppose Ukrainians fighting back. In all the statements from them and from the SWP and others, there is never any mention of support for Ukrainian resistance, let alone getting arms from anywhere. And that, to me, is the big difference between the two bits of supposedly anti-war movement. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Pete. Fred.
Okay, thanks, Terry, and thanks everybody for coming to the meeting and the speakers. I mean, I've been involved from the beginning. In fact, actually in 2014 with the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign, and obviously came back now. And I just want to explain a few things about our approach from anti-capitalist resistance. And I think the first starting point has really got to be, you know, the needs of the people of Ukraine today. Solidarity with the people of Ukraine, because they're the ones who are under the bombs of the Russian armies. The Russian army, which has Putin's army, which has invaded Ukraine, and as Simon says, it's a war on the people. And you know, for you know, as socialists, we've got to have a basic humanitarian response to that. It's an absolute atrocity. Just look at the pictures of Mariupol, you know, which are similar to Aleppo and so on and so forth. So. You know, from a socialist point of view, we should be side by side with the Ukrainian people in London and with all other Londoners. And, you know, I endorse Pete's remarks about the demonstration last Saturday, which was absolutely massive. And these were people just like us. These were people who work in the same jobs we do in education, in health, construction, whatever. And they were there for the same reasons that the small number of us on the left were there. And for those people on the left who think, well, you know, the Ukrainians, all those people are, you know, they've got illusions in NATO. Well, I didn't see any NATO flags there. I didn't see any flags of the Azov battalion. I saw flags of Ukraine and Belarus, but I also saw some Palestinian flags and our flag from the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign. So I would encourage everybody to work with the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign, because it has got links with trade unions in Ukraine, with Sotsialny Rukh, of which Yuliya is a member, and there's many other socialists and anti-capitalists in Sotsialny Rukh. And we have, as socialists, we need to support them as much as possible, so as an independent, left-wing, progressive trade union, anti-capitalist voice there with which we are in solidarity. So just a few things about the things that are coming up, which we can all help out with. First of all, obviously, the petition, which Pete and Dave Kellaway mentioned. I think it's important. You know, it's a small initiative, but it shows that, you know, there is another view about how to have a campaign in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. And then there's a demonstration on Saturday week, which I think was also important. I mean, it won't be as big, obviously, as last week, but you know, we need to be there. You know, we can do what some of the trade union left organisations are doing in Britain, in the rest of Europe, twinning with your trade union in Ukraine, providing aid. Simon mentioned the train, which is the Sudrail trade union in France is organising to go over there. There's coaches and buses and so on and so forth. But money is also important. Money, I mean, you know, the humanitarian organisations which will collect money, but also money directly to Sotsialny Rukh for them to help to organise. And the International Trade Union Confederation as well has got a very good appeal where money can be directed to trade unions there. Finally, just two last things. I mean, actually, you know, the people who think like us, not necessarily co-thinkers, directly co-thinkers anti-capitalist resistance, but people on the left who solidarize themselves with Ukraine in the way we do across Europe are meeting in a European network, which is going to launch a website very quickly with a declaration of solidarity. One thing I should say, which is actually different about the United Kingdom, the Westminster government, and the rest of Europe, is that the people in the rest of Europe haven't seen the question of refugees like we see it here. The refugees in the rest of Europe don't need a visa like they need a visa to come into Britain. So we've been quite strong about arguing for opening the borders and scrapping the visas. Finally, just one last thing which has come out of this European network. Unfortunately, the 23rd and 24th of April will be the second month of the war on Ukraine, and there will be demonstrations during that weekend, and in Britain we should join in those demonstrations. So thanks everybody, and make a note of those events. Look at the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign website, and obviously ours, Anti-Capitalist Resistance, and solidarity to Sotsialny, Rukh, and all the comrades in Ukraine.
Thanks, Fred. Okay, Simon, last thoughts. You need to unmute.
Sorry, yeah. No, I tried to put a thing in the chat, and this flaming Zoom has defeated me again. But it was just, I think that larger point about security guarantees and everything, we need to think really about neoliberalism, and which in a sense the neoliberal era came to an end in 2008-9. I've argued that the 2014 events, both in Ukraine and Russia's reaction to those, were partly, can be seen in the context of the fallout from that. We're now another few years further on, and now, I mean, war is an expression of capitalist crisis at the end of the day. I know that doesn't help us to solve concrete questions, but we need to see it in that context. And I mean, I don't see a system of security guarantees that can be so stable and so on without an enormous amount of suffering being transferred from one part of the world to the other by imperialism. I mean, that's the big picture. The other point was the one that was raised by Neil Rothney about climate. And again, I mean, these are huge questions, and I think it's right to see this war and the whole issue of climate change as part of the same crisis. That makes it look even bigger and more frightening, but I think it also it gives us an insight into the sort of movements that will be needed to challenge it. So thanks again. Thanks for inviting me.
You're very welcome, Simon. Good to see you. Andy?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, in response to Pat, I think, yes, it is right to send arms to Ukraine as for the reasons that he said. On the issues that Terry raised about climate change and around debt, I think the perspective that Simon's just outlined is the right one, that what we're seeing now in Ukraine is an expression of the crisis of a system. It's a systemic crisis that has many different aspects to it. And clearly, there's that horrible phrase that was used and that Naomi Klein kind of picked up on in her book on the crisis, or the way in which shocks were used. That phrase about never let a good crisis go to waste. And the supporters of fossil fuels and fracking and nuclear energy are going to try and capitalize upon this crisis, and we need to come forward with an alternative. And that means doing what Simon just outlined, linking up the crisis that we've got here with the war, with the climate crisis, and with the debt crisis, as Yuliya said. And as Terry outlined, the debt crisis is something that we haven't really taken up very much in recent years, and we do need to take it up, because these phenomena that we're looking at, the role of oligarchs, the kleptocracy that we're seeing in both Russia and Ukraine, all the things that Yuliya outlined are very much linked with that issue of debt. On the questions that Pete raised about the difficulties of building support, this is a huge problem, and it comes out of many weaknesses on the left for a number of years. I don't have an easy answer to it. I think there are multiple initiatives, as Fred outlined, that we need to be involved in. Some of them will involve doing things as socialists on our own, building our own demonstrations in support of Ukraine. Some of them will involve trying to intervene in other demonstrations, as was done last weekend with the big demonstration, having a left bloc on that. I'm particularly keen on the things that Simon outlined, the direct people-to-people support, the convoys, the trains, the initiative involving mayors that Simon posted in the chat. There are many things that we can do, and all of them have their strengths and weaknesses. But I think the important thing is maintaining that independent perspective that I think we've tried to outline in the contributions here and has come through in the discussion, looking at both the sort of immediate driving force of what's going on, the aggression that's coming from Russia and the reasons for that, but locating that, as I tried to say earlier before I got cut off by the technology, locating that in its connection with other oppressions, with the environmental crisis, with class oppression, with gender oppression, and looking at how that feeds into what's happening in Ukraine, and how what's happening in Ukraine also feeds into that, both on the one hand, strengthening reaction in many ways, but also problematizing things, making it clear to many people that the world as it currently is generates horrible crises and can't carry on as it is. And that is the audience, in the sense that we need to speak to, the people who are horrified by what's going on in this war, who want to help people in Ukraine, but who also recognize Ukrainian agency, that it isn't just a matter of standing back and helping people, but we also need to fight for a better system, both here and in Ukraine.
Thanks, Andy. Yuliya, the last word goes to you.
Thank you very much, Terry. The issue of security guarantees, I agree, and that there is some important chats in the chat function about how, obviously in this call, we're not going to solve the problem of international security disorder. But what we can do, and what we have already done to a large extent, is discuss some of the dysfunctionalities and problems and where those problems come from. The fact that we have the fact that we have the Permanent Security Council and veto powers in the UN is also a reflection of the post-Second World War international world order. And by now, I'm not naive or romanticizing the situation enough to think that we can, in one swing, kind of transform all of this. But there is an opening for pressure on the international security architecture to say, look, Russia has repeatedly been lying and they have abused their veto power, and therefore we need to review this architecture. Everybody on this call, I'm sure, is aware that one of the reasons that Russia was getting away with all of these lies is because they were not the first ones, nor the last ones who started lying to the Security Council and abusing their veto powers, and also neglecting to pay attention to the resolutions of the UN, right? But we without having to go to, to other permanent security members abusing their powers and and creating international disorder under the pretense of international order. This kind of the dialogue and the pressure, and there can be certain movements and also petitions and like pressures being put in place once this war is over, around shaking up the international security order, because of course there are those old imperialist powers there who have way too much power still in their hands. They are trying to capitalize on this crisis. They are trying to capitalize by further militarizing. So some countries who are resisting and sending arms to Ukraine are already announcing that they are increasing their own defense budgets, and we know that what defense budgets mean, right? So instead of talking about demilitarizing, we're talking about militarizing those on who nobody is planning to attack anyway. So that is something that can and should be resisted. But in terms of kind of NATO emerging victorious of this, the thing is that the old imperial powers within NATO, yes, they're talking about further militarizing themselves and investing in the military-industrial complex, but their kind of smaller satellite states are rethinking what their standing is, especially like in the Baltic states, Central Eastern European states. They're rethinking of actually how willing NATO is to protect them. There is that dialogue already happening amongst the heads of those states. And we've heard some important messages coming from Zelensky, and it's not like, he's designed them, but there are conversations happening in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and the Ministry for Defense that, he was like almost trolling NATO, going, well, we understand that you're not going to trigger, when he was addressing the US Senate, that you're not going to trigger the Article 5, that you're not going to get NATO involved, but can we at least get arms? Or if you're not going to protect us, then let's organize a different security force, right? And he was not so much even speaking to the United States leaders at that point. He was speaking to other NATO members in the Baltics and in Central Europe who are waking up to the fact that should they have been in Ukraine's place, they also probably wouldn't have been defended. Right, and so Zelensky in that call called for an alternative force. I'm not saying that he has the best idea, but there is already a beginning of the dialogue of what he was referring to as U-24. So it's like a united force for defense that would have a 24-hour response of all members, and aggressors kind of have to be defeated and something like that. So there is that dialogue already opening up, and of course, we do not have a big international coalition of socialist governments. So talking about some alternative security bloc is a little premature. But but there is a lot of exposure of the disorderly manner of the so-called international security system, and there are opportunities to put pressure on furthering that dialogue, and I think we need to seize them. In terms of energy, of course, as well, instead of talking about moving away from nuclear power when there were risks of nuclear attacks and when nuclear power stations have been seized, we are now seeing increased talks about investing in nuclear power so that we do not depend on Russian oil and gas. And that is something that I honestly, I cannot comprehend how you can twist that narrative that way. But yeah, it's also a conversation where I think we need to have a complete separate session on specifically on energy politics. And Terry, indeed, some of the developments you mentioned from Britain right now are absolutely outrageous. And and they can, of course, the fossil lobby will use this to capitalize on it. What's going on with XR in Ukraine right now, I cannot tell you with much precision, because of course, a lot of other agendas are kind of taking precedence, but I would love to talk to this at some point later. And all of these systemic crises, last thing I want to say is about the debt. I put a link to our petition on debt cancellation, and there is not just one, and we're building a coalition with progressive left in Europe and beyond. And we also have been talking with our friends and comrades in Syria, for example, and in South Africa. So we are trying to build an international coalition and with our friends in Seattle and in Canada. So we are, and of course the UK. So we're trying to build a big international coalition. And I think I agree that, if we're talking about certain security guarantees and certain fairness in the international system, of course, it's not just about Ukraine. We are simply now talking about Ukraine because it's yet another symptom of dysfunctioning of the system altogether, where the militarization, climate problems, debt problems, and the whole kind of neoliberal doctrine of exploiting and twisting the last drops of blood out of global labor and out of nature are done for the sake of accumulation of stupendous profits of the very few. So this kind of the logic of neoliberal austerity through the debt campaigning, and like, you know, we're building a coalition with the Jubilee debt Jubilee campaign in the UK and with the global debt coalitions. So like, it's a very big sort of movement, and this is one of those issues behind which it's easier to get politicians mobilized across different political bits of spectrum. Right, so this is, you know, this is one of those things that, again, if we campaign around this concrete issue, it's a little easier to get certain gains, right? And I think, you know, if like this kind of campaigning as per issue, like, you know, you can build some coalitions and actually get gains and then build up of top of that. So it could be one of the strategic things to think about. But kind of the indebtedness and the climate disruption and militarization, all of that, like, you know, is kind of it's the crisis of the capitalist system, of course, and this is why again, you know, the kind of instead of neoliberal austerity, what we need to be talking about is also kind of trying to get, I think tactically it's very useful to take some of the rhetoric of international financial institutions and turn it in its head and turn it against them. So there's already been talk about fiscal activism instead of fiscal austerity in IMF. Like, you know, we had it when Lagarde was still in charge, when we heard it from Georgieva when she was still in the World Bank, and now like she's in IMF, and Lagarde is now in the European Central Bank. So that kind of stuff, like, you know, there is the rhetoric, but then there is still, like, you know, all this neoliberal conditionality and fiscal austerity. So like, you know, we are trying in our campaign to kind of turn that against them and say, well, that you are saying that austerity doesn't work. We are in a deep crisis, to put it mildly. Put your own words to work, right? Let's look at what is the purpose of your organization. Let's look at what you are saying works and doesn't. Do it. I think, like, you know, looking not just to our comrades and campaign brethren and sisters and their rhetoric, but actually using the rhetoric of this organization against themselves. Sometimes just to at least expose the hypocrisy of them can be quite useful and tactical in our campaigning. So please join us in signing the petition, spreading the word. I've also put in, you know, what Simon and Andrew and a couple of others mentioned, like, you know, one of the things that can be done, I think Fred appealed to that as well, is that, you know, there are attempts to build left resistance in Ukraine, and there is great work being done through Sotsialny, Rukh, and through some other organizations and comrades with who we're working, anarchists, Antifa, ecological movements. So I've also put a link to our website and to the campaign to kind of support the left financially, but, like, you know, some can have a bit of money, and that's great. If you don't have the money, spread the petition, spread the word, go on demos. If everybody does a little bit in their station, it all contributes to something much bigger. And, you know, even like spending a couple of hours of your time in the evening to having these conversations and then having them with somebody else, that all adds up. And I think one thing that we can't afford to do is getting disheartened and walking away from this, because indeed there are so many different wars around, there are so many different crises, there are so many people suffering, and I don't even want to think the extent of all of this with the food crisis of what's going to happen if this war drags on. And there are some heroic Ukrainian farmers who are still kind of sowing their fields and the rest of it, but we understand that, you know, like, you know, if Mariupol is lost, 50% of Ukrainian exports goes through Mariupol port. Russia is already blocking like about 70 plus ships with grain in the Black Sea from leaving. It's a very, very ugly situation, and of course it's the most vulnerable people who will suffer, as Simon already mentioned. So like, there are lots of things to talk about and campaign about, and I'm really glad that we're having this conversation, and this, you know, the attention and the solidarity is really appreciated, and I want to extend that gratitude on behalf of Sotsialny Rukh to all of you for standing with Ukraine and for supporting us in this horrendous time.
Thank you so much, Yuliya, and thank you everybody who's participated tonight. We will put the video up on the website so you can share it widely with people who didn't manage to make it tonight. And I'm sure we'll find many other venues and places on the streets, on Zoom, and in the communities to continue these discussions, which are absolutely critical. Good night